I am from Port Moody, currently living in the land called Port Moody, which was shared ancestral territory of the Tsleil-Waututh and the Hayqwtun First Nation. Today it was overwhelming to come into the room today and to see all you faces and all of you gathered as we gather here today on the unceded core territory of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish First Nation, and also a land that was walked and journeyed and cared for by the Coast Salish nations all up and down the coast. So I raise my hands to those ancestors who are watching us and standing with us today as we gather to talk about how do we move forward in a good way. How do we each take our own responsibility here to help the future of all of our relations. So with your hands on your heart and your mind and your heart working together and your feet firm and feeling the ground that we are so privileged to gather and work today, I welcome you, and I welcome your ears to hear all the things that you're supposed to hear, and your heart to really take those in today. Hayqwtun.
My name is Irwin Oostindie. I'm a Dutch settler. I don't acknowledge myself as a Dutch Canadian because we're on unceded land, so how could I be Canadian if I'm born and raised in unceded territory? So, and I see a lot of settlers here, and that's a good thing because this is a Training the Trainers Day. This is a day where we take important time and space in our lives, in our professional careers, in our political work, to gather together and start being a force for redress, a force for change. There's a bit of structure for the day. There's actually quite a bit of structure, and we're going to do a lot of work. This is the 5th time we've done this with the Heart of the City Festival, and this is different work, and we can feel free if you're confused about why this is different and how this is different. Those are good questions, and feel free to ask those today. I hope you had a chance to meet people at your table. The first session is David Eng and I will talk about these ideas, like where are we at, why are we talking about redress, why aren't we talking about reconciliation, and what's been happening in Vancouver, what's been happening in the lands here, what's been happening federally with Justin Trudeau's hand over his heart gestures, and where is this going? So that's the first hour to unpack. The next hour, our dear friend Gabe George is in Ottawa today, or flying to Ottawa. So good example of in the way, out of the way. So it's like, Gabe, don't feel bad about canceling yesterday. Go to Ottawa and raise some money for Tsleil-Waututh youth, because we're fine. And so Ronnie and Cease and Brandon Gabriel is going to be piping in from Nanaimo. So super powerful panel to talk about Coast Salish sovereignty. If you haven't figured out yet, the focus on Coast Salish sovereignty is where I'm hoping that we focus our political work, not on reconciliation. We can talk about reconciliation till whatever. I was going to say the cows come home. I don't know where that went, but it's a Dutch comment. So if we're not talking about Coast Salish sovereignty, we're being distracted, and really that's the premise. I've had the privilege and the joy of doing this work for about 30 years. I started actually just here at Main and Hastings. Actually, I'm reminded of this ugly building's history, right? Being brought into the jail cells here in the back alley after political protests. So about sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty. But Canada doesn't want us to talk about sovereignty. They want us to talk about reconciliation. Reconciliation is a fallacy because reconciliation is, the premise of that is that there's a relationship to reconcile. As far as I've been taught by Coast Salish people, there was never a relationship. So there's conciliation, but there is no reconciliation. So that's the flavor. Pushing it to redress, pushing it to repair. That's the definition of redress. So So I've had the privilege the last 3 years doing graduate work at SFU School of Communications and looking at, my focus is on the spectacle of reconciliation. So I look at both spectacle, and I know there's some people here with festival experience. A lot of us work in building spectacles in our work. But spectacles can also be wrong. Spectacles can be forms of distraction. Spectacles can be hegemonic tools that capitalism, that the market uses, that state actors use to perpetuate their dominant agenda. So that's where spectacles are dangerous. That's Guy Debord wrote about that in 1968. So that's my focus. So I've had the joy and the privilege of being able to spend time to write and to think about that and organize events like this to bring people together to say, like, let's move the conversation away from reconciliation. The other elephant in the room, and I always feel a little nervous as a white settler calling this out, but is the desire, just like multiculturalism, the desire to promote multiculturalism as a tool, arguably, to sustain white supremacy. So the dominant white history and the systems of Canada welcome immigrants. I heard it yesterday in class, actually, a graduate student saying about, I don't remember exactly, but it was basically like, you know, Canadians and immigrants, and she was referring to the immigrants being the people of color. And it's just, that's how Canadians see themselves. They don't recognize the fact that, I remember being up in Barkerville years ago and thinking, like, right, there was a time in history in British Columbia where those anti-Chinese, those anti-Asian laws were brought in to keep white power. And if those racist white laws hadn't been used, would we really talk about the Asian invasion in Vancouver and Asians are buying up our houses? And right, it's just we've had a century of this, more than a century. So it's important to talk about those ugly truths of Canadian culture. And this is an also challenging one, because as long as Justin Trudeau is saying, hey, let's have reconciliation, we all want to be proud, like Jody Wilson-Raybould. And she's a great Indigenous woman. It's great that she challenged Trudeau, but she has a termination agenda for Indigenous rights. So I'm not political, I'm not a fan of Jody Wilson-Raybould. She was brought into the federal Liberals because of her 800-page manifesto rights framework to create a fourth tier of government, and the fourth tier down here below municipalities was First Nations. And Russell Diabo and Pam Palmater are great experts on unpacking that. So pan-nativism is this notion that, like, check it out, Vancouver, right? The Indigenous cultural institutions in the mainstream of society, Bill Reid Gallery, Talking Stick Festival, you know, these are not Coast Salish cultural institutions. In fact, they present almost, you know, 3%, 4% of their programming is Coast Salish. And that's the Indigenous professional arts institutions in Vancouver. So if we're not addressing this as cultural workers or as administrators, as curators, we're perpetuating this fantasy that the federal government wants us to. And you look at this, you know, you've heard me probably say this before, the funding statistics, right? 99.98% of Canada Council funding coming into Vancouver does not go to Coast Salish people. 99, maybe it's improving now. That was from 2016, so maybe it's 99. So how can our sisters and brothers from the Coast Salish communities pierce into this mainstream? I'm not suggesting that Coast Salish culture is weak or anything. I'm not saying anything about it. I'm talking about dominant Vancouver culture. It's not my place to instruct, construct, manage Coast Salish culture. My work is to talk to my peers and say, this isn't working. I've been watching it for decades. Some of you have been watching it for decades. We were talking about this in 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993. And it's still, you look at the statistics. So for me, it's not necessarily a political thing, it's a statistical thing. Let's just talk quantitative research and say, hey, Canada Council, you have a blind spot, and it's federalism, and it's not place-based. So we need place-based approaches which happens to be lifting up Coast Salish sovereignty. If we're doing place-based work in Coast Salish territory, we're inherently lifting up supporting and getting out of the way of Coast Salish sovereignty. So that's the work for today. So let's invite up our friend David. And David and I will carry on a little bit with this subject for the first another 20 minutes. So basically I just gave a bit of an intro on that work, and you've been, and we're going to hear from other people today who are doing this work, and your work obviously is, you dive into it and you get your hands dirty. Lee Miracle talks about how, especially important for settlers, like if you're not fucking up, you're probably not doing much work. I'm paraphrasing. And you take risks and you do work, so maybe just let folks know a little bit about what you do in terms of this.
Sure. So my name is David Ng. I'm the co-artistic director of Love Intersections, which is a media arts collective of queer artists of color. Over the past, I guess, 2 years, I've also been involved with Primary Colors, which was an initiative started by Chris Crane-Kelly and Franz Trepanier. And the intention of that was to find ways to decolonize the Canadian art system by placing Indigenous arts practices at the center of the Canadian art system, and recognizing that there's also a role for racialized artists in doing that work. And one of the projects, so it was a Canada-wide initiative that has seeded sort of local hubs of organizing. And some of the conversations that we've been having recently here is essentially looking at and interrogating reconciliation, as you've been describing, and also the ways that it's manifested in diversity and inclusion, affirmative, which is essentially, you know, affirmative action, which is essentially a tool of white supremacy, and that the new sort of fabrication of diversity and inclusion doesn't actually challenge the foundation of white supremacy, and that the values of white supremacy and colonialism need to be transformed. And so a metaphor that we've been thinking about this through is that the diversity and inclusion basically is Indigenous people get one seat at the table, POCs get one seat at the table, but we didn't build the table, pick the chairs, pick the room. And that the transformation that needs to happen is to actually rebuild that table, and that process is sort of what we're trying to engage with, and recognizing that interrogating those systemic things of colonialism, patriarchy, systemic racism, and white supremacy are part of those, part of the work.
So I remember more place-based walking down Hastings here on Canada Day in 1990 with Roots of Resistance, and that was Indigenous, Asian, Black, different, Amandeep Singh, Gord Hill, a lot of different people. I think CISO's around then. And that group was a formation of people of color, anti-capitalist, saying similar things, and that was back in 1990. 1992, some of you in the room might remember, the BC Arts Council funded this whole affirmative action thing around people of color. Like, oh, right, the VSO is all white, and all the main arts organizations are all white. Why don't we fund them to do board training to bring in more people of color on their boards? Here now, 30 years later, now they're doing the same thing with Indigenous people. So is that basically what you're describing? That how does the dominant structure stay the same?
Exactly.
People who are like, we were white supremacy back. If you said white supremacy, you'd be like, oh, Antifa. You know, like white supremacy is one of the beautiful things in the last couple of years. Is like, hey, white supremacy is becoming a normative language. Like we actually can talk about white supremacy.
Yeah, and I say that word a lot. Yeah, no, totally. And I like what you also, when you brought up how multiculturalism also functions as a form of white supremacy. So, I mean, how I understand it is that it's the Canadian nation, colonial nation state, basically sanctions POC cultures and Indigenous cultures under parameters that are determined not by Indigenous people or people of color. It's given this sort of little corner of what is allowed and funded, and that is what needs to be changed from the very, very top in terms of the resource flow.
So what are you seeing? You know, the challenge of doing this work and calling out Jody Wilson-Raybould as a white male is, you know, it's uncomfortable for people, and especially people who ascribe to liberal politics or feel like, hey, I'm trying to be a part of the solution. I don't blame people for not knowing this history, because we're taught this in the education system. So this isn't about shame or white guilt. This is about actually figuring out our political analysis, having access to the political discussions. Popular education, today's a popular education event. We're distilling analysis, and we're encouraging people to absorb that analysis. So in that context of reconciliation, you know, being spent, you know, what was that, $500 million, 2017, Canada 150. Hey, you can throw some good parties for $500 million. Yeah. So it's not, it's easy to get confused by reconciliation being a good thing. So what in your travels, how are you finding people, like when you say, well, reconciliation,
yeah,
it's more than just reconciliation. So how do people absorb that critique?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind is like one of the values that comes up often is the idea of relationality, and so how are we cultivating different relationships with Indigenous people, and I'm thinking, and also in that our relationship to arts and art as artists as well. So I'm thinking about the ways that arts and artists are commodified, for example, under the state, and how, and Irwin, you've talked about this as well, about looking at how to shift our ways that we value cultural workers as well, and that's a part of the reframing of, I think, of that conversation as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember last year, Christy Lee Charles was here talking about same thing, like art versus cultural practice. Yeah. Cultural practice being embedded in communities. Cultural workers, I argue, the same. You know, yeah. Our cultural workers are just like people who make bread and clean streets and repair plumbing. Like cultural workers are part of our community fabric, but capitalism wants us to treat it as a fetishized commodity, and that, you know, typically the wealthy and the upper class get to bestow and enable us, you know, sponsor the theater so we can go see the theater.
Yeah, and I wish Cease was here, because Cease Wyss actually taught me how to make video when I was 13, 20 years ago. And one of the values actually that she taught me, and I'm a filmmaker, was that it wasn't just the skill of shooting the video, but how do you honor the person in the seat whose story is being told? I'm a documentary filmmaker, right? And that's not something that's taught in art school, right? It's very, if anyone is a documentary filmmaker, it's very extractive, really. You take someone's story and then you craft it based on a script, right? And that was an initial teaching that Cease taught me, was actually around the value of, and the service and the responsibility, the reciprocal responsibility that artists' role are in the community. And that's not something that under the sort of colonial framework of applying for a grant with a script and executing it and then having no reciprocation with community. That's not something that is, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the Vancouver airport, you know, as a great arts benefactor, you know, basically cultural tourism quickly blurs, and it's good that, you know, that's a wealthy benefactor that a lot of Coast Salish artists can benefit from, but it's embedded in that is also these contradictions.
Yeah.
So as you're talking to people around reconciliation in the cultural sector, do you feel sometimes that you are making traction? Is there traction?
Yeah, there is, although I think that there's also this sort of scarcity mentality that is, again, imposed by colonialism, right? That like there's this little pocket of funding that, and then there's just that whole crabs in the bucket type of thing that is actually a tool of colonialism as well. As you've described, like 99% of the funding is not going to Coast Salish people. But then the conversation, as you've alluded to, needs to be addressing the resource flow that is the barrier, right? So I've encountered that quite a bit as well, and sort of like when do we, as you also mentioned, sort of the shared struggles between Indigenous folks, between people of color and Indigenous folks, but also the differences in my positionality as a settler, and yeah, as a visitor here.
Yeah, I'm mindful that we've been doing this is our 5th event. I think it's not the 5th annual, it's the 5th event in 4 years. But Vancouver Art Gallery is an arts organization that many of my friends show their work in. But it's also an organization that wants to build the biggest cultural project in the history of BC, which is this $235 million new home, and with no plans for permanent Coast Salish gallery in the city reconciliation. Exactly. And what I've noticed in the last 2 years of critiquing them publicly is now they have brought in Coast Salish person to their board of trustees. But to your point earlier, that doesn't address, that's their way of addressing the structural problems. Puts a hell of a lot of work or pressure on that one Coast Salish person to resolve colonialism in Vancouver in that organization.
And I would also ask too, what sort of power does that person have in making the changes that they say that they're going to do, right? Because I think what you're alluding to is that it's also quite tokenistic, and how do we move beyond just those, again, going back to the affirmative action, like we need to have a quota of this many Indigenous people or people of color or people with disabilities, and how do we actually transform those? What is the process of that? Does that transformation happen?
Yeah, and mindful about I mentioned the 500 million on the Canada 150, and then we had here the Drums Calling Festival. The first curators that the city, so that was a festival that the city of Vancouver initiated, and then approached the Three Nations saying, hey, do you want to do this? After they'd actually already applied to Heritage Canada for funding. And then, they hired, the first consultant they hired was the same consultant that the city hired for the Olympics, from Squamish. And I think Hayqwtun only signed their agreement 3 weeks before the festival. So there was, that's not a good way to do collaborative work, obviously. And the problem with that festival was, again, the spectacle. It was great because a lot of people in the room, some of the people who were in the room were offered short-term contracts. Some were deeply undervalued in their work, paid 2-3% of what they actually needed for their projects. The way to spend that $2.3 million would have been to do development and to say to Squamish and Musqueam, here's $800,000 each. Do what you want. We recognize that you don't have a cultural plan in how we understand cultural plans, but here's $800,000. Maybe you can hire cultural workers, maybe you can train cultural planners, maybe you can build studios, whatever you can do. And then the city of Vancouver would benefit in years in the future because those communities have more infrastructure and more supports, rather than the spectacle that the public gets to benefit from for a short term.
Yeah, and that what comes to mind is accountability, right? What is the accountability to the community, and whether that sort of how does the arts practice? Because I noticed also over the past few years too, there's been a very big division between the accountability between the arts and the community, and that's again because of the funding parameters of Canada Council, but also thinking through that value as well, responsibility and accountability.
So, just one more question on redress versus reconciliation. Is this a foreign language? Like, do you see people talking about redress, or because in the States, like, there's that movement around reparations for slavery, and being Dutch, I know in Holland we are dealing with this ugly history of slavery, and but Canada seems really reluctant to talk about repair and
land
hashtag land back.
Yeah, I mean, when the Reconciliation Commission happened, I mean, it was a non-binding process that the Canadian government went through that was, they don't actually have to follow any of the policies at all that they ended with. Right? I was working for the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa at the time and watching this happen from afar and being very upset about it. But I think that now, I mean, it's been a couple of years, there has been heavy critiques of that spectacle of reconciliation and thinking through that, like the process of reparations as well. It is a conversation, but I haven't heard it very much in terms of how that might look like in the arts, for example.
Which is what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it's not funny. When Trudeau came to power, like we went from this, the dark days of, we always look at Harper, but it's actually the right wing of Canada and their market funders. We went from conservatism to liberalism, and it's important to learn and understand those traditions, those political traditions, because we everyone was like, oh great, now we've got democratic liberalism. Okay, so we've had 150 years of on and off of that. It was confusing to think that Trudeau and the Liberals didn't start this reconciliation gesture, but it was actually Phil Fontaine from the AFN, who then went on to be 3 out of the 5 last AFN chiefs who are oil and gas consultants, and his non-Indigenous partner, lawyer, life partner, negotiating with the Harper government on reconciliation. I mean, it's their model of reconciliation, and sometimes we think like it was a Trudeau model of reconciliation.
Yeah, and I would just add to, just to compare the two models so the Canadian reconciliation model was built on the Truth and Reconciliation models in South Africa, and there are many problems with that model, for one, but the major difference was that the TRC in South Africa was, it was on the brink of civil war, and the constitution was entirely rewritten based on the TRC. And there are many problems with that system, don't get me wrong, but the Canadian system was not even binding. So all of the 94 recommendations are recommendations that are actually, the government doesn't have to follow, because if they did, the constitution would have to be rewritten.
And then you said you were in South Africa, so South Africa had these days-long, nationally televised hearings.
Where perpetrators had to attend and speak truth, not just victims. Right? Yeah,
so there was no justice component in Canada, deliberately, pre-negotiated. No one was held culpable. There's no, the churches are still owning their lands. The other clever thing that the Canadian government did was that they just talked about residential schools, one of the 10 colonial apparatuses, right? So, let's just apologize for residential schools and but all these other implements of like the pass system, ironically, that Canada exported in 1948 to South Africa to build apartheid, came from the pass system in Canada. So we perfected apartheid, made it operational. So I think it's really important, as you pointed out, that the foundations of the reconciliation program in Canada are flawed. And again, I'm sometimes embarrassed to call out Reconciliation Canada because it's led by Indigenous people, but RC, Reconciliation Canada, was the top-down, federally chosen delivery agent for Reconciliation in Canada. So rather than, as you pointed out in South Africa, you've got decades of ANC communist revolution, trying to take over the government appropriately, and then this device comes in to reconcile. Here in Canada, you have a pipeline-funded NGO, a lot of the labor by non-Indigenous, very, very liberal, close ties to the federal government as the delivery agent to do popular education. And I remember when the Walk for Reconciliation happened down here, I was asking and really provoking, trying to understand what the volunteers, they were all wearing the t-shirts. It's like, they were just volunteers. They were not, in my opinion, agents of change, community organizers. They were like, hey, I want to volunteer. Okay, great, you can be a marshal at this parade. And for me, that's the wrong model. The right model is actually popular education, political organizing, direct action, legal strategies, all working together. And so it's been sad watching Reconciliation Canada, RC, be be unchallenged, that this is all we get. And the same thing with my friend Andrew Reimer in the City of Vancouver. We won't get anywhere if it's City of Vancouver top-down doing reconciliation work. If it's not in every library, in every community center, in every union hall, in every cultural organization, in every church organization, if we're not all doing this work for 3, 4, 5 years together, it's not, nothing is going to happen. It's just a brief performance. Any thoughts? Boom.
Should we take questions?
Yeah, let's do some questions. Sarah, do you want to? No, not ask the question, but you want to hold this and. Oh, sorry. Can you summarize that, please?
It's not really a question. I'm a Coast Salish artist. I've been doing this being an artist for 28 years, and my mom worked with the Residential Survivor Society under Chief Bobby Joe, and I learned a lot from her in terms of the Indian Act and the residential schools, and now with this reconciliation, as time went on, it was like the wool being pulled over Canada's eyes. In terms of, it was just a way to say we apologize to the residential school. We're trying to make a relationship, a reconciliation relationship with Native people. I started to figure out early on, of course, as an Indigenous person, it's really cool to think that we're going to make this change for the better, but really it's just, it's like saying, to me as a Coast Salish artist, I get sick of people saying, we want to recognize we're on the Coast Salish territory, blah, blah, blah. Because it doesn't really mean shit. It doesn't. And the reconciliation is the wool over Canada's eyes to say, well, we apologized and we're making efforts to rebuild the relationship. And the reason they don't want to acknowledge the things that happen to Indigenous people in Canada is because they don't want to be financially responsible. They don't want to give back lands that they had stolen before. So acknowledging these things on that level will enable us as Indigenous people to take back what was rightfully ours. And the other thing is about rightfully ours is it wasn't ours. The land, we belong to the land. So Squamish, and I don't know if there's anybody here from Squamish or Stoughton or Musgrave, it's no offense to the tribes, but we're colonized now in the sense of like, this is our traditional land. This is where we roam as people. And the land owned us. We didn't own the land, but now because of colonization, we have to say this is our traditional territory. We have to say that this is our land, but really it's not. It's everybody's land. And we survived off the land, not just because we wanted to own it. We couldn't, I remember a story on the east coast of Columbus coming and saying, we're gonna take this land from you. And the natives were like, yeah, go ahead, take it. You can't pick it up. They didn't understand that it was like you were being thrown out of the territory. So, I kind of get the fact of what they're saying about reconciliation. The other important thing, I think, is this $500 million should have went to healing our people, not to funding representatives to talk about reconciliation. It should have actually went to each nation in Canada so that they can learn how to heal themselves from addictions, from sexual abuse, mental abuse. At least a huge majority of it. And the residential school getting the apology, and each member got $10,000, or each survivor got $10,000 plus $3,000 for every year they were in the residential school was shit. Because a lot of those people were in addictions. They didn't know, like $10,000 is like $1 million to them. So they didn't know what, to be able to take that money and go, okay, I want to heal myself so that I can heal my family, so I can heal my kids and my grandkids. This generational poison was to stop. I'm lucky I had a mom who was very smart, very strong, to help me get past this. I'm 46, and it took me 40 years to get past that abusive mentality and anger. I won't get too far into it, but I was one of the lucky ones to have a mother that was strong enough to guide me to heal myself. Even though I grew up in a broken home and she stayed for so long, she was still strong enough to keep me normal, for lack of a better term. Anyways, I just wanted to say that. I won't say anymore. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. What comes to mind too is I was just thinking about some of the racist narratives around land claims and around, like, what do you mean we have to give up our land? Yet, you know, on a regular basis, we totally ascribe to allowing the Canadian government to run our rights and our lands, right? Like we would certainly.
I was just gonna, did you finish it up?
Yeah.
I just keep thinking about hashtag land back, sorry. Land back. You know, I mentioned I'm embarrassed sometimes when I challenge because to your point, I'm not critiquing the critical healing work and as you point out, the funding should have been spent rather than a spectacle for white people's alleviation of our white guilt, but for your communities. And that's by design, and how it differentiates it from South Africa is that here in Canada, we put the labor on the Indigenous people. You hurry up and heal so we can build more pipelines. And that labor, Dallas Smythe talks about audience as commodity. Right? So like when we witnessed the TRC hearings at the Coliseum, you know, I saw East Van Indigenous women fundraising to make food because the TRC didn't provide enough food for the families inside. And so I was just thinking, wow, those women are like surrounded by Trans-Canada Pipeline logos, and they're raising money in East Van to supplement, you know, the food for the participants. But that's by design, that we as dominant society put the labor on the Indigenous people, and then as Dallas Smythe talks about the audience as commodity, like the labor of the Facebook posts of the Indigenous participants. Canada benefits from all that free communication production. That's worth, you know, if you're in the marketing industry, that's worth millions and millions and millions of dollars. The labor was all provided for free, volunteers, by those participants, creating expressions of healing, talking about their journey, as your mom did her work. All that work delivered our reconciliation. So who here spent months of their lives dealing with that process? None of us? Okay. One? Months of your lives?
Yeah.
Day in, day out?
Not every day.
Well, through your cultural production work?
Yeah.
So 3% of us in the room? Whereas if you ask an Indigenous person, how did the reconciliation process affect your life in the last decade? You'd be like, okay, well, I've spent hundreds of hours, thousands of hours. It's your lived experience. So that's also, I think, how spectacle works and why we haven't started the work yet, which is the work of dominant society. And partly talks to our theme of today, getting out of the way, or are you in the way or are you out of the way? Question, more questions? Silence. Right at the back, Siobhan.
Hi everyone, I'm Siobhan. I'm so thrilled to be able to be a part of this conversation this morning. And, oh, I'm going to stand. As I look around the room, often we find ourselves, or I find myself, in spaces where although we're using sort of the moniker of POC, I may find myself as one or the only person of African descent in any number of spaces. And it's often a challenge to carry that into conversations when we talk about non-Indigenous peoples on the land, coming from a stolen people, living on stolen lands, is a very unique perspective to people of the African diaspora. And not to be overly controversial, but it's a perspective that often doesn't enter into the conversations. There's a framework or a narrative that is speaking often to white settlers and an assumed whiteness within the audience that is taking in information. And I want to introduce it to recognize the erasure that contributes to. That being said, there are many journeys that bring POC people to Canadian soil. But just for a moment, speaking specifically of those of the African diaspora, being of a stolen people is unique and deserves acknowledgement within the conversation as we frame our conversations out into rooms where unintentionally often the assumption is intended for white audience listeners.
Thank you, Siobhan. And that's partly why it's important for all of us to not use that term settler, all of us. I mean, I try to always talk about settlers and migrants, just to at least in a tiny way with language acknowledge that not everyone is here settling to expand the empire. And so when we look at that difficult path for people to be here on unceded lands, it's not necessarily by choice of, we're going to go to Australia or South Africa or Canada. But to your point, and you being in the trenches, I was going to say the ditches, but the trenches of the fighting in the cultural, sometimes the ditch of the Canada Council and all these entrenched systems, as David was talking about, trying to disrupt, trying to fight for what was often referred to as diversity in the arts. Can you share, do you still have the mic?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or reflections on what lessons you've learned from those decades? And vis-a-vis this current talk about reconciliation?
Goodness, now I don't know if I can stand it. Now that you said decades, goodness, if I hobble up. Looking out from my perch over the decades upon decades of cultural work.
It's true.
Just pile on, Irwin. We'll be having lunch soon. No, I mean, the terminology, the narrative has changed certainly. I mean, to give a little perspective for those that don't know me, I'm an artist, both writer and performer and singer. I've been doing cultural work for a long time. And I currently work as the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Director with Vancouver Fringe, which is a new appointment. As well as doing wellness work and family programming. Good grief, it's a long thing, actually. I mean, I can say that the language has changed. And what I try most often with different generations, sometimes feel left behind as the language changes. My mother was a forerunner in the community in her time in Ontario, working with the Ontario government and labor relations and policing services. And we use terms like rubrics, and people feel left behind for not being current, and yet there's value and worth in the work that came before. And I caution us as we get more and more advanced, as we move along into our own journeys and the millennial sphere of activity, that we don't leave and dishonor the wisdom that has come before, right? Young feminists think they invented it. There's nothing before. So I would caution that there's a degree of care, especially when, what is it, as Maya Angelou says, when we learn we do the best that we can, and when we learn or know to do better, then we do better. That's a mishmash of that quote, but the sense is there. So I would just lead with that we extend the generosity to welcome in as many generations of wisdom as we can.
Thank you for that. It's also making me think that that short-term memory also makes us and future generations have to start from the beginning again and again and again. And so, yeah, that sort of generosity for remembering all of the prior generations also strengthens the work as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of the importance, sort of teasing Siobhan for the decades, but the importance of intergenerational work, right? That this work should be intergenerational, and because of capitalism, we kind of stratify, and it's like the notion that intersectional feminism or intersectional work is new. It's like, well, no, we just used to call that multi-sector or cross-sectoral or anti-imperialist, or internationalist, or the rights, the impacts. You look at the history of Vancouver, the Kalyans and Hayqwtun were talking 20 years ago about how the highest dropout rates in Vancouver schools were Indigenous and Filipino, right? And so understanding why that was structural, that's intersectional analysis, and that was decades ago. One more question before we wrap this up, and yeah.
This is, sorry, it's Donna. This is a comment rather than a question. Just, I'm thinking, following up on Siobhan's thoughts that she brought forward, that for myself it would be helpful to recognize that the TRC was flawed, limited, etc., but at the same time it was profoundly transformative, that it did happen, that it could happen, and that the commitment and the courage of many people that were involved in that, and Indigenous people, and those who came forward to share experiences that needed to be heard and thought about. It's important, I think, to honor that too, even as you're looking at the ways to move forward in healthier patterns and to change some of the systemic challenges and limitations of the past. Just wanted to share that thought.
Yeah, and I think that goes actually back to what Irwin was saying about how recognizing the labor of Indigenous people that happened during the TRC as well, but also to also recognize that the function of it as a spectacle and how it's performative, and that the work needs to continue.
All right, let's take a Bannock and coffee and tea break, washroom break. Let's focus on Coast Salish sovereignty. And so this beautiful panel is with us for about an hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes. Think about Tasha's contribution, because the last session of the day today is on what we can do as a community. And Tasha's doing community scale work. So Tasha has a very important modeling for that. But do you want to start, Cease?
Sure. Okay, there we go. Can y'all hear me, or should I come a bit closer? And go for this.
Oh, it's glued on there.
Oh, it's let's move it over a little bit more. Now that we know that it's been safety secured. So,
I feel constrained.
I know, me too. It's time of unconstrained times. Unhuff Squile. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I am very grateful to be here. Toits Tanat, Queens Na. My traditional name is Toits Tanat. Everybody mostly knows me as Cease. And yeah, and I look forward to our very thoughtful and passionate discussion, and it's really good to see everybody here today. So thank you all for making this time. I'm going to pass it on.
Oops, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ronnie Dean Harris. Professionally been known as Oz12 for 20-something years as a hip-hop artist. My ancestral name is Malithuk, and my family's come from Stalo, Stadtwil, Iqaluit nations. Most locally, my 3 times great-grandfather was Chief Coquitlam, where the town of Coquitlam gets its name from. So if you live there, you're welcome. And I worked with Irwin for a number of years, doing some programming here in the city, and I just recently moved to the city of New West, where we're going to do our best to decolonize the oldest city in Western Canada. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I introduced myself this morning. I just want to add that my lens is also, it's not just in the municipality of Port Moody. I've been a dance and theater artist for a couple of years. With Siobhan down there. So, decades.
Some summers.
Yeah, some summers. So my perspective is, I feel that I walk and have walked in 2 streams, and that it's been this last 15 years that I feel myself walking in and being able to sing and learn my language where I'm meant to be. I finally feel that I'm finally coming home, and because I grew up without my community, and I grew up in an arts community that never felt like mine. I never belonged there. In the practices that they teach at Simon Fraser, which is where I went to school, and in the contemporary mainstream world of being a theater and a dance artist. So things are starting, I am starting to see changes, and there are some positive things that I would like to talk about later, but I just wanted to give you another view of my perspective.
Brandon?
Sure. My name is Brandon Gabriel. I'm from the Kwantlen Nation, and my ancestral name is Hayqwtun, and my name comes from the ancient village of Squamish, which is the Brunette Corridor area in Westminster. And I am sitting in my home in Nanaimo territory, which I'm pretty stoked to see all of you all now. I work with all of you, so this is kind of cool. Good morning, everybody.
And Gabe, I mentioned earlier in the morning, Gabe George sends his regrets. Gabe is out today doing important work fundraising for youth in Hayqwtun. He's over in Ottawa. Gabe and I were joking about Ronnie, how Ronnie should have a PhD in this subject. So in terms of the colonial apparatus that some of us participate in, and the cultural knowledge from the land here, Ronnie, you've taught me a lot about, and Cease as well. Cease and Ronnie, you two are my biggest mentors in this work, especially. Ronnie, you and I co-produced a conference 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Coquitlam on it was a Coast Salish conference. We had 30 or so panels, and one of those was on Coast Salish design, I think, that you were speaking at. But maybe if you can set the stage for the room around, before we get into per se Coast Salish sovereignty, a lot of people think of, and they're confused, like, oh, what's the problem with Haida art in Vancouver? Like, so what is this kind of, what's the elephant in the room when we talk about Coast Salish culture in Vancouver?
I mean, for me, I think I've spent a lot of years researching and trying to understand how exactly we've gotten here, especially in the history of my people and where I've lived. I lived here in Vancouver for, I don't know, 20-something years, practicing art, doing art here. And then, coming to understand the direct actions that were taken by the Parks Board and the City of Vancouver in the 1900s to practice cultural erasure. And so removing Coast Salish design aspects our villages, our artistic narrative from the land and replacing it with a washed version of northern cultures and exterior cultures, which has created sort of in design, in marketing, in branding, a pseudo-culture that has been marketed to the globe from this area. We as Indigenous people here, is my family coming from Hayqwtun, all the way up to Symposium and back to Hayqwtun and Port Douglas. We have iconography, we have arts and design and culture, we have masks, we have songs, we have sacred designs that we adhere to. And so in my work as a graphic designer, I tried to use those elements of design understanding to bring back what would originally have been here and what we can develop from this point on. It was great to be able to work in the city, on these lands, and to be able to try some things out and to continue research. So for me, I think when we talk about reconciliation, they talk a lot about the truth part being the big work, and I think there's a lot of uncomfortable conversations around the history of Vancouver that are still being needed to add and research to be disseminated to people and put into the public narrative. And so, at a point where we weren't seeing Coast Salish program events in the city or Coast Salish curators, we decided to build spaces where we could just make people those and start living and breathing that. And myself, I'm very grateful that we had a great pathway of people who trailblazed for us and created youth programming to get us in the arts and to get us, actually behind editing screens and actually into gallery spaces and onto sets and behind equipment and using tools, so that we were well prepared when we were young to express ourselves. And I think that's a continuing narrative in the city, especially with the new Indigenous teachers and faculty at Emily Carr and the different university spaces around. And I think that we're just kind of beginning to understand who we are as Coast Salish people in the past, but also in a contemporary nature of what can we design and what do we need to design from our viewpoint. Something like that. Something like that?
There's an unnamed city councillor, who recently said to the Heritage Commission about how maybe it was overstated that Coast Salish people were using all the land, and it's fine for us to do whatever we want because really Coast Salish people were underutilizing. They weren't necessarily all over Vancouver. That's from a currently sitting Vancouver city councillor. A gross comment, to be certain. But what in terms of the survival of Coast Salish culture, Ronnie just talked about the fetishization of Northwest Coast culture and the kind of commodification of this kind of pan-native Indigenous culture. There's the secret societies, there's the winter ceremonies. That work is not for settlers, that work is not visible to settlers. Can you describe a little bit about how you have witnessed this confrontation of the resurgence of Coast Salish culture and these ongoing colonial dynamics that are on top of it?
Yeah, well, I think about how, in my 20s, like my late teens and early 20s, being in the same neighborhood and having very little presence in this neighborhood of what our culture, to me, the only presence of the culture were the people. And at one point I had a conversation with one of our now former councillors, Sequoia, a woman whose song many of us share for protocols, but it's actually, something to be known is that even that our songs for protocols are we can only share certain songs. We can only share songs we're allowed to share in the public, and even Sequoia's song had to be fixed, as we say in quotations, fixed. It had to have a ceremony to be shortened to share in the public. So we won't fix our culture for the settlers. And I'll say that very clearly. It's like the whole thing of people saying to me for years, well, what do you think about reconciliation? Well, I don't have to reconcile, you know, especially as an Indigenous woman living in this neighborhood and watching women disappear over the last 30 years and hearing conversations with teenage girls that stick together, they're serial killers in the hood, you know, at a night market event. So those are the real elements of what Indigenous people here face. And I've done a lot of work with the working group on Indigenous food sovereignty with Don Morrison, and we often talk about how we're told that the land is not being used. And it's like, well, okay, if anybody knows anything about land use and caring for the land, then you know that there are times when you don't use areas of land. And in Indigenous cultures, for years, we move around. We're semi-nomadic people. That's why we have summer and winter villages. That's why there's this myth that Squamish people are newcomers to here, because maybe we weren't present when the tall ships came in. Maybe they came in the middle of summer when we were in our summer village up in the Ilaho Valley. And there are people here that know the Ilaho Valley because they stumbled upon a decades-old fight to protect that, you know, from the very beginning of contact. Anybody that knows the story of when our chiefs, our leaders, not just from here, but other nations traveled across on the train and over to England and waited a month while the monarchy had a vacation that kept going until they realized, oh, the natives aren't leaving, okay, we'll go meet with them. And it became like, and they went there to say, we're never giving up our lands, our waters, these are for our future generations, and we are still saying that today. And the stories that I've come to know, my goal has always been to learn as many stories. I know that I've learned a lot of these lands and waters, but there are so many more that I will never know. But that doesn't matter to me, as long as I can learn as much as I can. And even living here, I actually tell people I'm very privileged. Even when I've been extremely poor, living in this neighborhood, eating 1 meal a day, making sure my daughter had 3 meals a day, I still felt privileged. And you want to know why? Because I get to live where I'm from. Because there are people in this room who may never see their homelands again. So I am privileged because I don't have to leave my home. And even if I have dysfunctionalities in my family's here. If I want to know how they're doing, I can see them. But that is a different level of privilege than what I've seen through my ancestors' eyes and my own eyes. And that other privilege is a privilege that many of you have. Oh, you might think you didn't have much, but you had more than any Indigenous person in this room. Because, we're still the only culture in Canada that has to prove our identity and that our identity expires. And that people want to know how to get in on Indian status. And it's like, it's not the privilege you think it is. And it's a very small reward. It's not even a reward, but it's a small token is really what it is of what we've given up. This place here is, to my people, called Lakai, which is a grove of beautiful maple trees. And yet, the whole street, all these streets are filled with cloned maple trees, not naturally bred. And anything you learn in history about Indigenous people, it really comes down to, the government has tried to find ways to clone us and make us a certain way, assimilate. It used to be the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Then it became the only good Indian is an assimilated Indian. And then we hear complaints, oh, what are you now called? Well, I'm Squamish. I deal with these realities of Indian and Aboriginal and whatever the governments are using to keep us out of UNDRIP, you know. They don't want to have to recognize that we have rights, that we're Indigenous, because then they have to protect our rights. And it goes back to everything we're all fighting for. And I would hope that everybody in this room is fighting for the same cause, to stop resource extraction, to prevent, you know, species at risk from dying, and so on and so on. Some of the projects I've worked on in my community, we did a project with Van City, and everybody from here to Hope talked about their projects. Oh, we fixed this wetland, brought back Indigenous plants, and it was beautiful to see all that happening. And then we got up, and you know, I was really emotional because I was like, 2 kids jumped off our bridge, off the Lionsgate Bridge the week before, because they're lost. So we're not just trying to put Indigenous plants back into the landscape, we're trying to keep our children alive. And so if the city thinks that we're not using a space, like maybe they want to actually have a conversation with the families who have rights to that land that aren't accessing it because of the many barriers that they have. And it's not always about poverty, it's about knowing our family lineage and knowing who, knowing at what point that we were separated from our communities, and knowing what our ancestors did to have to give up their rights in order to have an education and to have their children have education. So enfranchisement, disenfranchisement, those are all words that people are still learning, but we've all grown up with those words. Friends of mine my age, I didn't know about the residential school. Friends of mine who were Catholic, they had no idea. And they're traumatized, and I'm like, okay, well, you gotta deal with your trauma yourself, but let me tell you that this stuff has existed. And let me tell you just the story about my mother. And that's all I have to do, is talk about one of my relatives that experienced residential school. And for me, I'm lucky to have that her story is still alive at 76, that can still tell you what it smelled like in the pantry she got locked in at the age of 5, and had the only night of her life where she got real food in that residential school. So that my mother can still tell that story, and she can talk about our lineage that goes out to Yale, and that together we have dug up more information about both of her parents and finding their bloodlines, my grandfather having bloodline in Desroches / Nikamin, and also being from here, being Hawaiian, going back and looking back as many Hatsalanos back that we can. Oh, there's Jamie. Hi, Jamie. And everybody has to say hi to Jamie. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Jamie.
And when we're getting ready with our ancestors. They're pep talking us. That's how we get out the door. That's how we get things done. And that's how we stay aligned with one another. And that's how the reality is for Indigenous people, and specifically people within the 54 nations of the Coast Salish nations that exist. And you know, if somebody doesn't want to say they're Coast Salish but are within those nations, they have every right, because that is not our term. I use those terms because I have to, in a sense, dumb down to settlers so that you all feel better, that you understand what I'm talking about. But I'm not going to call myself an Indian. I don't want to use the word Aboriginal. There are all these political contexts, and I have the right to not have to explain that. But I have to explain it. And it doesn't end, and it just doesn't end out of this room, it keeps going on. So, you know, as far as land use goes, we are the best caretakers that we could ever be, even today. Even with the concrete jungle, even with the clone trees on the land, and even with, you know, the onslaught of invasive species, which get ready for it. Settlers are part of that. And, you know, just as English ivy takes over and can kill 1,000-year-old cedars in a couple of years, so can settler culture do that to Indigenous communities. I've spent my whole life being told to take care of people in other countries when I cross the bridge, and I'm like terrified of how poor some of my community members are and the barriers to them getting through their poverty and being lifted out. It's complicated. So for me, these lands and waters have never been given up. And if a piece of land isn't being used, it shouldn't be a question of, well, the local Indigenous people don't want it. Don't make assumptions about us. You don't know. And don't assume that, that we don't have ideas and ways of manifesting better use of those lands than are being used. When I worked with the park board about 12 years ago, I was really imagining a landscape for the future that would have started by now, and not just for our people here, but the Indigenous people that have had to come and live here from their communities. And I, at one point, was trying to suggest we build longhouses for everybody whose nation is here in different park spaces, so that all those people have places they can have their own cultural gatherings where they can engage in their culture without feeling ashamed and without having to hide it and not having to explain things. But that's complicated. Anyway, I'm gonna leave it on that, and we'll go to Brandon.
The more like internalized colonial effects community, where people believe that a non-Indigenous administrator has all the answers to all the problems, yet has not shared any of the effects of colonization or yes. She's got very busy work. But what it's done to me and my family, when I offer a different perspective to that type of, in that type of environment, it's not welcome. Like I really have to, in order for me to sort of be my authentic self, I get pushed around in my own community, and so even on my own land, these colonial forces make their way into elders' council table, the chief and council chambers, the arts and cultural community, and so I try to reconcile. I wonder where is this reconciliation? Everywhere I go in my own community, I'm always up against this force that is always intent on pushing me out. It's part of the reason why I'm speaking to you across the ocean now, because the effects are so damaging. And so my perspective on it, I think I've learned this from, looking at what's going on in other. Okay, hold on. Okay, good. Can you go over there, please? Oh, okay. All right. Shut down. Okay. Talk about being pushed around. So I think what I'm learning is that community doesn't have to be in that place where all your people were forced to live on. That it can be in other places, in other spaces. If those spaces open up for us, we can go to them, and we can join forces with all those other people who endure those onslaughts. And so I think that's like a positive thing, and I think I'm witnessing that, and I feel like I'm part of that in a way. So I'm not sure what else to add to that at the moment.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
good. Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah.
I think Cece talked about that, and as we learn, one of the elephants in the room, or one of these kind of unspoken things, you talk about how the Canadian, the colonial government, Indians, and Ronnie, you've done so much historical analysis, Indians, Natives, Aboriginal, Indigenous, Squamish. So we like to, it conveniences us settlers, migrants, to be able to manage this horrible problem we've created or inherited by thinking, this is how it is. So we're essentially forcing compliance on our terms, and not recognizing that it, as you're all pointing out, it's complicated, and we're living in colonialism. We are in colonialism right now. There's genocidal policies that are in place right now. So can you share your thoughts on all of you on that? You know, Ron, you introduced me to that concept of time and space. Like, in this time and space, this is some understandings we have. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 10 years from now, we will definitely be in a different time and space. And so it's important for us in the room to always carry that knowledge.
Go first.
Who I thought I was 20 years ago as an Indigenous person is not the same as who I am today in my current understanding. We inherit fragmented bundles of who we once were from our ancestors, from the people who came before us, who handed down a bundle. For me, research has really just kind of stemmed off from what I was left when my grandmother passed away, because they left me with some notes, some stories, some photos, and a lot of things to come to further understanding of. There was a point in time where I call it the white paper ceiling, where you think you've hit the white paper ceiling of researching all you can know about your ancestors. Or like, I have every document, I have every newspaper article. This has got to be every photo of my grandfather that I could ever think of. As technology grows, as they scan more documents, if you put some money into it, you can access more documents. And my aunties love me because of the stuff I've uncovered and been able to go, oh, this is a photo of that person. Oh, this is that document that connects these things. As we do this individually, we're also doing this as nations, as communities, as families. Some of us, like myself, like my grandfather's name is Hayqwtun. Our family name was Hayqwtun up until 1915. I couldn't find an apartment in Hayqwtun if it killed me in the last 5 years. Now I live in Sapperton. I can see Hayqwtun from my porch, which is pretty awesome. It's the closest I've been to living on my own home territory since I was a baby. Right? And so privileges, if we look at, well, how come these Indians don't just go back on the land? See, she's out on the land right here. She's out on the land. For those of us that have to find ourselves in the city, our old people used to go into the bush for 10 years to try to find what they call their snaam, your medicine power. Now, we spend 10 years in the arts and the administration field. We try to survive the rent, and we try to survive the renovictions and the pyrovictions and the cultural displacement that's happened since 2010 in this city. And we try to go home with some sort of understanding so we can help our community to help themselves in this city with different layers of overlapping cultural boundaries and limitations that kind of constrict us into like, to certain people, I'm hey, it's Ronnie. To other people, it's like, oh, it's Oswald, it's that arts guy. To other people, they know me as a song. They know me as an ancestral name. They know me as who I am, connected to spirit and land. That's the part of culture I don't think that y'all will ever understand, because we're not going to let you. So if we're looking at these 94 recommendations, yeah? 94 recommendations, if you have them out, can you find the one that talks about land? Because there's none. And so I've been saying this for 5-6 years now. If you really want to change the arts and cultural space of Vancouver, you give us venues, you give us space, and you go away. You don't have to see what's in ceremony. You don't have to be a part of it to rebuild it. Right? Some of us have built and put our blood, sweat, and tears into organizations and had to let them go. So while we have that sort of trauma from our organizational trauma, we all live within this body and realm of trauma now as well. So we have cultural, we have territorial acknowledgements, and we've all heard that. We acknowledge the nearest band office to here, and we put our hands up. But we need to acknowledge the trauma that now lives in the room as we kind of interact in this traumatic space together of decolonizing this city. And I think that we've left that realm of ceremony out of who we are and how we're going forward by coming up with protocols, protocol policing, a realm of boxes and checks and things that, did we do that? Did we get an elder here? Did we pay the elder? I can't imagine how stressful that is for y'all, you know? But it's commended because it's part of a process of learning and unbundling where we are in reconciliation, where we are in redress. And it's a long process that we might not see the end of. It's a process that we're gonna have to hand off that work. My son, I'm gonna be like, son, just make sure you check the Dropbox links I sent you. There will be research there for you to continue. There are some processes and definitely some tasks at hand. And so we have to kind of look at what's in the bundle in this room, in our communities, in our organizations, and really look at what we truly understand. And I work with Brandon. We run a program called Reframing Relations, and we talk to students, we talk to organizations about this concept of reconciliation, right? And I say this to all people, is that you need to be very honest with your understanding of where you are in this term of redress and your terms of understanding your relationship to not just Indians or Indigenous people, but your relationship to land, water, and stars. Because like Bishop Tutu says, for us to really reach a reconciliation point, we have to understand that we are all victims of colonization. Some of y'all just sit a little bit more comfortable on the side of it. But we have to recognize that this is all work that we are all doing, right? And I've worked with some organizations who've hired us to go out and speak to their boards and speak to their stakeholders, and they're like, oh, this is great, we're gonna do our reconciliation workshop and it's gonna be good. And right away I say, this is not reconciliation. This is part of it. This is sparking and unfolding the bundle of what we understand to be these ideas of redress, and taking and acknowledging it in the room, how we all understand it. Putting in understandings that we have, taking out things we don't need, and rebundling it up until we meet again. Or till we hand that bundle off to our next generations. And it's kind of like a weird concept that we don't really think about anymore. It's the long fire of what we're building. Developing arts communities, developing music scenes, developing dance, theater, all these things. Whatever your scene is, you have to develop those scenes so that they can create sustainable economies to interact with one another. So we can free ourselves from waiting for funding or waiting for space from the city, competing for business licenses and liquor licenses, working at venues that charge exorbitant amounts and never give us a cut of the liquor sales. And meanwhile, our arts goes to fund this machine of capitalism here. Money made from the backs of Indigenous people who died on the streets and those of you who are paying taxes to this very day. So we need to really look at the large frame of the colonial apparatus we live in, a living drug market, the industrial complex of poverty that we live here in the heart of the city. Why you call this the Heart of the City Festival is that this place is a system of colonial oppression, where we are. And so some of us live easier on it. We drive through it and we, oh man, that was harsh. But there's other people who are out there, we will never understand their position, where they're coming from, where they're going, or where they came from. And so, for me, I stepped out of Vancouver for a bit and was able to look at it from the outside. And now you're looking at other cities and how do we use arts to actually activate healing and activate understanding and cultural awareness. And I'm glad to see people here having this conversation, because engagement in most communities is the toughest part. Getting people out without iPods or free meals and stuff like that, it's tough business to get people out.
To bribe everybody.
Yeah, because we live in a world of capitalism. Those who aren't here now couldn't afford to be here because the city's so damn expensive, right? And we're creating an arts desert here because the prices, everybody just leaves because we're not flourishing as artists in the city because we're too busy trying to survive. You learn that in any civilization class. It's the nation states, city-states that have farming, it's sustainable, you feed your people, they can not think about survival, and they can build themselves, build arts, build culture, build sciences, alchemy, yeah? And so, as the city sort of wages war on our poor people and artists, we're up next. I guess we're the next poorest people here, right? You see, I drove to San Francisco a couple weeks ago, and you see it there. It's like here, but turned up, like the energy that's coming at you, the people who have created a new wilderness in these colonial cities. It's a new type of wilderness because they've been left out by the rest of us. And so I just think it's, if we talk about these 94 recommendations and if we're flipping it to an arts style understanding of it, we need to look at space. We need to look at decolonializing the capitalistic viewpoints on space and how it makes money and earnings, and we need to look at the system of capitalism within our arts, because it's extractivism, and it goes on to the branding of companies who even go into food sovereignty and use indigenous food sovereignty as organic food marketing narratives. There's an extractivism that's come from this city since day one. They marketed this place. It's like, oh, it's the wilderness, you can just come here. And then people got land grants and they moved here. And we're still experiencing the shock of that. And I think that because there's so many things to keep us comfortable, movies, TV, film, drugs, television, Netflix, all that stuff, that it's easy for us to forget about what's been burnt so that we can stand next to the warmth of this big smoke. Right? And I think there's nothing else I want to say.
Before we go back to Brandon, go to Tasha, and Cease, maybe this afternoon we can talk about the Gassy Jack's statue when we talk about community action. But, and Ronnie, 2015 we produced that Coast Salish Studies conference in Hayqwtun, because we didn't want it to be at Emily Carr. We didn't want it to be downtown Vancouver where it would just be consumed. We thought, let's actually take it out into the middle of the territories, away from the saltwater edge, deliberately. And 2 years before that, the All Nations Festival started in Port Moody at the 100th anniversary of Port Moody, and a city councillor was like, oh, hey, wouldn't it be great to have some native dancers as part of this 100th anniversary celebration? Next to the museum, which is this horrible, antiquated version of history, white settler history of Port Moody. But we've come a little bit of a ways, and you've been critical in that work in Port Moody, Tasha. Can you describe what type of barriers you've experienced, structural barriers, to essentially support Tsleil-Waututh, their presence in Tumtumayam, and bringing Tsleil-Waututh and Hayqwtn's visibility? And I know all of you have been part of that work as well, so maybe you can let us know some of those structural challenges.
I think the structural challenge that is always problematic is the fact that the land is governed
by a family of people who aren't really families, but when I look at them, they're a family of people, a council, who can say yes or no to what happens on their land. So a few years ago, I recognized on the land where I'm raising my children that there's no visible recognition or honoring of the ancestors whose songs I hear and who cared for what is now known as Port Moody for thousands and thousands of years. And so I wanted to change that because it needed to be changed. No, you don't like that word. So I wanted to reignite the language and the stories that are there and have been dismissed and erased. So I went to the city with an idea of a project to raise a house post. I actually wanted to raise a gateway at Rocky Point Park. So if any of you have been to Port Moody, it's this huge piece of parkland that faces the Salish Sea, and it historically has been a gathering place for many nations because the tides are safer, easier to go into the Salish Sea to the First Narrows, which we call the First Narrows and then it's now known as the Second Narrows. We go to the First Narrows and then the Second Narrows and out. So many nations used this land and gathered there, and I wanted to have a huge gateway. And the mayor flat out said when I'm at the council with a room about 200 people, well, that's never going to happen. And so he put up a barrier for me, and I kept going. And because I knew I was going to find a way anyway, and so now we have this first house post that was raised it was given as a gift to the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and the chief asked us to raise it in Port Moody because it is a symbol of our commitment to create spaces for those ancestors' voices to be heard and for Tsleil-Waututh to have their presence known again where they should be known. And then even in that, to honor the process of waking the spirit of that house post, we were going to hold ceremony on National Indigenous Peoples Day, which was the first National Indigenous Peoples Day that Port Moody recognized. And again, I had backlash. The family that runs and governs the land, didn't want to give me any space, so we were having it in the parking lot. Until this new administrator came on board and said, what is this amazing project that you're doing? Why are you doing it in the parking lot? This should be in Rocky Point Park. So we indeed ended up going to Rocky Point Park, and we had our ceremony, and now the post is raised, and it's been given the name Semamet with the permission, and it was the idea of the family in Tsleil-Waututh. And so we have a reclaimed Indigenous space in Port Moody, and currently I'm working with Brandon to work with Hayqwtun Nation as well. And we are the barriers that family in Port Moody, the governance, they're opening their doors to hear and listen to me more. So today at 2, I have a meeting to go talk about redress, to go talk about how I can educate that family of council members who are making those decisions. Because on a ground level, Brandon and I, and Cease and Ronnie have done a lot of work on the ground to make those voices sing and have that language heard by the ancestors, but also for the little children, for the new ones coming. And so on the ground level, the land is holding all of us. We all walk on this land, and it's so unfortunate that there are this family that caused the barriers, and funders, they cause the barriers, but we still find a way. we still, and so I encourage all of you too, in your barriers and the bureaucracies and all of the policies, you find the way, because we have. And I'd actually like to hand it over to Brandon a little bit about that.
I think I've been used that every time you pan back to me, she's got more and more berries on her face.
Right on.
I think broadly speaking, I'm really fortunate I get to work with fortunate that I get to work with Ronnie, and I get to work with Wyss and Irwin. You're always providing space for these kind of things to happen, and I'm really appreciative. Like, just a lot that goes on. That makes a lot of these amazing projects that come along possible, and you're all a big part of that. So it's like, I just want to say it's an honor to just to sit here and be counting the money. I think it's pretty amazing. And so I may be speaking specifically about the project in Port Moody. So we had, Tasha had approached me several months ago about doing a house post project at Street Factory, and so I immediately I was really stoked to ask to be part of that. And then in the initial conversations that we had with the Hayqwtun Nation, and gathering that community together to come and share their stories. And one of the stories that had emerged was, I think, really pretty relevant to what the discussion is about today. And so part of the story that I heard the elders and the leaders tell about their ancient village that was on Hayqwtun Mountain. That when the colonial engineers started making their way into their lands and saw the value in that property, that swath of land on that mountain, that their action was to forcibly remove that community from their ancient village, which caused a diasporic movement of their community members who ended up being spread out all over British Columbia, from the Washington State, across the United States, and across Canada. And when they blocked the water from flowing to create the electric dam on that mountain, its intention was to annihilate that community. It was an official policy to annihilate the people from their land. And so the best way that they did it was blocking their main food source from ever entering into that waterway again. And around the time when they were blocking this off to create this dam, community members had camped out at the base of that mountain and were hand bombing salmon back up into the estuary where the headwaters were, in the hopes that the salmon would stay and thrive and continue to live without making their way down to the main river channels to go spawn across the Pacific Ocean and back home again. And it had been about 30 years after the Hayqwtun Nation had been blocked from entering that land. And community members made their way up into the mountain, and lo and behold, the salmon were still thriving. They became a landlocked species of salmon that stayed in that waterway and continued to thrive. And so the community believes that the spirit of the humans, the people in the community, are intertwined with that salmon. that the resilience and the ability for them to respond to that annihilation tactic didn't work. And the story that they wanted to be told on this kekin, as we call it in our Hunkarina language, for outpost, was the story about resilience and that survival and that ability to adapt and to continue on. And so that was the story that we agreed to tell on this outpost. And that was about the same time we were up into the mountain where their old village used to be. And we found a fallen western red cedar that had fell naturally. That was that they had, that Metro Vancouver administration, who oversees the watershed. Can I hold it, please? Okay. And so that story was really entwined with the land too. So this tree that had fell was from their ancient village, and so when we brought we did ceremony with the tree on the mountain. We brought community members and elders up to that site and youth, and we put our intentions in the work, and we promised to take good care of it. And then we brought it back down to the valley, the hatchery. And when we counted the rings on the tree, it had over 600 rings in it, making it a pre-colonization artifact that we're working with. And so that to me, there was a lot of power imbued in that. That this mighty spirit withstood years and years of colonial acts that were bent on harming people and the land and the animals on it, and it endured. And here we are today. We get to work with that power, and we get to work with that symbolism, and we get to work with that actual physical presence, and we're reinstilling the power of it back on the land again, and we're doing that work with the youth. It's their space, it belongs to them. This is their legacy, this is their story, this is their time on the planet to take their power, and so I feel really honored to be able to do that work. And so I think, I like, it's an amazing work that's being done in Tasha. You have an amazing vision for that, and I'm just really grateful to be part of it. And it doesn't get lost on me that we're working with this old ancient spirit. It never left the land. It's always been the power, our power has always been here. And so I don't know what else to add to that.
So if we can, we've got about 50 minutes left. If we can pull back up from Hayqwtun territory and Tsleil-Waututh territory, and the theme this year is in the way, out of the way, and that's not a coincidence. Tasha, you were just talking about that white family in Port Moody governing that claimed jurisdiction. I know my own work. Many of you in the room do this work. Sometimes we're in the way. Sometimes we're trying to figure out how to get out of the way. Hopefully you hold me accountable.
I've always held you accountable.
Nice little gently home. But can we just talk a little bit about that? What is that? And Brandon has lots of experience with that as well, as a commissioned artist. The dynamics aren't, we don't want necessarily 2 million Vancouverites to phone you next week and say, oh, we're ready for redress. But what, in a good way, what would you imagine that you're in the way, you're out of the way, in a timely way, with resources? What are you feeling when you this whole theme of today, in the way, out of the way, what comes up for you?
I've been looking at it like this. I think every city, organization, family, community, a semblance of people has within them, in between them, a bundle. And for us, like, each individually, we have a bundle. And I think, for me, I call it's cheesy, but I call it the research bundle. It's the work that you're doing to have a better understanding of that relationship to land, water, stars. For us, we do a lot of genealogical stuff as well, trying to understand names, stories. But I think as organizations, if you're looking at your mission and mandate, to really put that in your value statement of what is the research we are doing in the long run, and how can we help the local First Nations with some of that work that they're doing. How can we make space for place names, for stories, for creation? You know, we look at the realm of disruption, and I think there was a very great understanding and growth that was disrupted upon contact. Whereas we spoke common languages with the land, and we had our own artistic understanding and narrative of that relationship. I think many of us are trying to go back to regrowing that and like picking it up where we left off. And so for me, I'm just trying to look at what information you guys have. As a researcher, someone who's just trying to understand it, let me look. Let me look at your collections. Let me look at your fawns. Let me look at your finds. Let me dig in your archives. Don't make me go to a university to have a PhD and get some permission from some old dusty people in the ivory white tower to do the research our nations are paying students to do. So it's getting better. I have great relationships with the History Museum in Ottawa. New West Archives just said, come on down. Port Coquitlam was like, there's work to be done, right? And I remember when Idle No More happened. You guys remember Idle No More? Did we remember back that far? Idle No More happened, and so we had a series of what they were calling parlors, where we just drank scotch and ate cheese, and then like hung out with a bunch of thinkers, and it was Indigenous people and some mainstream white folks and settlers, and we would just drink scotch and talk about, well, what is this thing Idle No More? And this one fellow stood up and he goes, you know, the thing that scares me about Indigenous nationhood and sovereignty, I think, is the most unsettling thing. Which was funny. He's like, the most unsettling thing is that Indigenous sovereignty nationhood is a direct threat to what it means to be a mainstream Canadian. And we had a great laugh, those of us on the native side of the table. But that really stuck with me after, is that I think in terms of this relationship that we're looking at, is as you help Indigenous nations achieve nationhood and sovereignty, you are also unraveling a huge part of your Canadian identity. So have ceremony for that. Take care of yourself for that. If you're experiencing and you're going through the reconciliation trauma porn that is out there, that has been provided for the darkness for us, mind your cortisol. Mind your trauma when you take that back out into communities. Because hearing those stories and feeling the weight of guilt, I think, has been a struggle for way more than many of us have been working. Because there's no ceremony involved in this exchange of energy that we have, except for the arts. We're creating those ceremonies as we go. We're creating our governance systems within us with how we project through our music, through our songs, through our arts, through our programming, through our understandings of social justice and the needs of our communities here. We're creating that as we go. But we need to be very mindful of the trauma that sits in the corner. And as we unravel that, what it is you're unraveling of yourselves. Because, like I said, who I was 20 years ago, I was Stallo. Remember?
No,
I used to be Stallo. Hey, I'm Stallo. Now I don't even know if Stallo is a thing. Stallo is a political body. It's a political grouping of nations that only existed since Wilson Duff mentioned it or something. So the reality of where we're going as Indigenous people unravel themselves and our stories start to breathe and our songs start to dance themselves, there's going to be a lot of different changes within who we are and our relationships and how we understand them. And as raw as we feel when we're going through it, you're probably not recognizing the rawness that you'll feel, understanding these stories and how, we all live off the avails of a colonial empire. And a lot of this, it's hard to not sound hyperbolic when we speak about it, but we all live off the expenses of these people outside. We all live off the expenses of those trees and salmon and the livelihoods of ecosystems that have given themselves up so we can have this material stuff that we have here today. I try to be very thankful to be an artist, because I could have been a roofer or something that just had to physically give my body to things. I'm very grateful that I can think and I can speak and express and to help contribute to the long fire as part of my career path. And I think that the fact that there are so many people in here for an event like this, that we would have tried this 10 years ago and would have been a lot tougher discussion. The fact that 75,000 people marched in terms of reconciliation, the fact that people have read 94 recommendations, the fact that there is intention is great, but the road to where we're going isn't paved with those intentions. We have to learn to activate those things into how we live and to how we speak. Someone asks me, I get the ignorant questions when I do things, sometimes when I'm painting or I present. I did a presentation with Van City, with their risk management team, which is awesome. Because I have a pretty, if you want a really in-depth, like 3-hour presentation on a simulative policy, oh my God. That costs a little bit more than what they gave me there, but he comes up to me and goes, well, what is this territorial acknowledgement? So what does it do? What's the purpose of them? I don't get it. I go, he's like, how is that reconciliation? I go, it's not reconciliation. I said, territorial acknowledgements are not something you can just do or give somebody to sing a song and send them off. It's the recognition of an intention to change the way we relate to each other. That's why we call my program Reframing Relations, not Reparations and Reconciliation. We are reframing our relation with how we interact. If we had these cultural protocols that we're trying to teach in these organizations and these systems upon contact, we wouldn't have a lot of these problems we have today. There would be a different understanding instead of a forced realm of understanding, right? And at this point now, we live in the realm of the nonprofit board structure. Many of you doing your tax receipts for the upcoming fiscal year, nonprofit nightmareism, and then trying to decolonize that program, but you have to be beholden to a board structure, and we got to make sure the board's up here, make sure we're doing what the board's saying. We have to really challenge that, because organizations cannot decolonize within a decolonized governance framework. Right? And so there's certain organizations, like the Media Lab has a council of matriarchs. Just do that. Right. You just have to implement things and change things and really, really create bold ideas towards change, because colonization was a bold idea in the first place. And it's going to take bold ideas and thinking. And someone to just stand up and go, hey, what if we did this? Right? But we live in that colonial trauma where we go, well, when I was at this organization, this happened when we tried that, and we need to really not limit our dream time to where we're going, right? If we're able to reframe this thing, then we have the power to design a better future and a better system of how we build it, and leave it for these little ones out here. Look at that little one right there. For the young people so when they step into these roles, it's just easier and better, and they can thrive and survive and to create and design more features and featureisms. We're done.
And this is a bit of training the trainer, so many of these folks are going to and we'll talk about this afternoon, transform your organizations. So maybe a final quick round around what would you say to folks around are you in the way, are you out of the way, and how when you receive an email or a phone call, and Brandon as well, you're often commissioned, what's that relationship like, and what would you say to folks if you took all that memory, what would you say back to the room here and say, this is how, this would be more effective, or this would be a better way to move forward together? As a commissioned artist, in the context of this as curators, as commissioners, as festivals, as cultural spaces, and you as working Coast Salish artists.
Just trying to think of what to say in just a few short minutes, but I mean, I feel like just listening to this conversation and thinking about how each of us on this panel has worked to create positive changes in our communities, and we've looked at all these places. I think about the way that the most successes come from starting those conversations. Like I'm gonna just put Miranda on the spot for a second here, but Miranda from Burgundy Village Museum, her and Sanya are two women that I've worked with over the last 6 years, and I was really just introduced to them through Takaya tours. And when I first walked into the site, I was like, so colonial. And how are we going to decolonize this? Okay, this was even a few years before that project started, but that conversation started because people in the workplace wanted it to change, and they're still working to change that. But it's like not just sitting there on their work site doing that work, attending events like this, networking with people and sharing the ideas that have worked and haven't worked, and about the protocols and land acknowledgement, how people it's even divided within our own communities. And I tell people when they ask me, I'm like, when you came to Vancouver, did you just arrive and you just started living here? It's like, yeah. I said, in our people's way, you couldn't even come into this city without being acknowledged and saying who you are, where you're from, and who your families are. And that's how we all talk. Even if we don't know who some of our family are, that's part of our work, is learning who we are and where we come from. So somebody, like myself, who's again been privileged to live within my community, at the same time, I didn't know until I was an adult that it was illegal for me all the years of my life going to visit my family on the reserve, because I was a non-status Native or Indian under the Indian Act. I was not considered Indigenous. It was very confusing for me growing up but I go to visit my granny, we go here.
Feel Native.
Yeah, I feel Native and I look like all my relatives, at least on my Indigenous side, and from what I've seen on my non-Indigenous side, similarities, but even my father understood that he had to be accepted in. And, you don't just, so many people just assume, we've talked about that comfort level, well, I'm just here and I've arrived. And they don't even think about the places they go to visit in the world. It's just, I liked it on the Expedia, so I bought a ticket and I went there. And oh yeah, I think there were some natives that lived here. It's always like we're always a past tense. But in fact, in all those places, we're all still here. Even for the Beothuk, that were pretty much massacred upon contact, whether it was from actually being bludgeoned and killed or being infected by the first infected blankets that arrived. It's like all of those infected blankets that hit the Atlantic coast, they came out here and they hit us 3 times. We were hit 3 times, and we're still here. It was kind of funny that so my daughter just moved into West Van, and we're just kind of giggling because we both now live in North and West Vancouver, where we're actually, our people are from, but I haven't been able to afford to live there. And luckily I have roommates so I can live where I'm living, and my daughter has a family, so they found a place. But we were talking about how, just how at this point in our lives we can't even believe we can live where we're from. And so I went to pick her up one day to get the girls to school, and the heater guy was there, and he had a really thick English accent. I'm like, oh, where are you from? And he's like, well, from England. And I'm like, oh yeah. He's like, where are you from? I'm like, I'm from here. Your people came and killed our people, and well, we're still here. And he's like, okay. It was so awkward. It was just this moment of like, I was like, I'm not challenging you, but you asked me where I'm from. I'm actually from here, and my DNA is in this building. I'm sure of it. And he was like, wow, that's amazing, right? But it was like, it made him really think about where he is and what he's doing, and I have those kind of conversations a lot, and I know it makes people uncomfortable, and I know most of what we've talked about today makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And it's not like our intention was to come here and just create discomfort, but we're all gonna agree on this, that we've been uncomfortable all of our lives, and yet we're right where we're from. You're in our living room right now. You're in, actually, it's more like the Costco, isn't it? This is like a gathering spot here. We're in the respiratory and health section where, you pick up your rose hips and your licorice fern and go down the ways and get some camas bulbs and, maybe find some stinging nettle and on the way maybe get an elk, throw that in our canoe and keep going. So in our way of thinking, we're still living there. But, the two worlds thing is a big thing for Indigenous people. And we have to constantly, we've been saying this, we haven't changed our story in the 500 years since the ships first sailed to these continents here. We're still saying the same thing. I'm still sharing the stories of that train ride and that ship that went across and came back, and about the women who saved the lives of many people that lived in this, blossoming village into a city, and that our people still tell that story. I've learned that story from the descendants of the women who rescued people. So in our minds, we never stop talking about it. Our people still talk about it, and that is a common thing you're going to find in all Indigenous communities, no matter where you go. When my daughter was 5 or 6, I took her on a road trip across the States to work on a film project. And all the places we went, we're driving this big old American car and vintage old ride. People were like, you're so brave. And I'm like, well, it's an American car built in America. There's got to be parts if I need it. So I went out in my land canoe and paddled through several states. My biggest joy through that whole journey was the people that we would meet, and the topic of my work was about food. And it often turned into stories of creation stories, because something my mother has said to me in the past is that most of our creation stories focus around food. And it made so much sense to me, because I went back to, my teenagehood when I helped her research for the Hayqwtun people. And the stories I learned were about wapito, wild potato. Learned about the Thais, or the Halls, the transformers, and the gifts of food they brought to the people. I learned about the resilience that a place like Hayqwtun, so small and so cut off from each other. You'll have a little reserve over here and a little one over here, and then we'll put it in 2 or 3 other new city districts, At the time for the Hayqwtun people, they were like, this is all of our land. This is where we traverse, it's where we live, and we have our neighbors and so on. But today it's like, oh, it's Langley, it's Maple Ridge, it's Surrey, it's, you know, it goes on. And we've never had a say in those developments of those cities. But I see in every news break that's come out, especially in the last week, with all the successes of the Squamish people and Hayqwtun and the work that is being done through, you know, the developments going up at the village of Snock, continuing to fight the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and I've had to remind people it's not Kinder Morgan we're fighting, by the way, it's Canada. We do these canoe tours, and people are like, oh, there's the Kinder Morgan Center. I'm like, no, it's not. Had a group of 3 canoes full of mostly young guys who were like from a pretty privileged school. I said, that's actually yours. They're like, excuse me, what? And I said, your taxes, the careers that you're gonna go into are gonna pay that off. They were like, what? And that's the truth. Because by the way, Canada bought that. That's Canada. That is not Kinder Morgan. Guess what? You're all on our side now. Because we've been fighting Canada since before it formed. And so as Canadians, you're fighting your own government. And you now know what it's like. You're on a level playing field with us now. You understand. Because anybody that's young, whether you have children or not, but if you have children in your life, all of you are paying that off. And we have been paying it off all along. You're finally paying it off. Another misconception about Indigenous people, we don't pay taxes, we don't pay our education, all these lists of things we don't pay, yet I lived in this neighborhood. I had to work to pay my rent. I raised a child on my own. Yes, I have family, but they're all pretty poor. Any jobs I did, I gave extra money to my parents. And I've just always done that. You know, because most of the people I was living next to are people that were moving here and sending money home to their parents, and I realized, you know, it really is our job of that generation when we're old enough to work to keep supporting our families. So there isn't as much privilege as people think, but I just wanted to kind of end it with letting you all know you're on the same level as us now, whether you thought you were or whether you wanted to be or not. You're where Indigenous people have been all along. And so if you think that it doesn't affect you, it affects every single one of you and the next 7 generations. That's it.
Brandon, last comment to you. We're just on the theme of in the way, out of the way, and what you would say as a last comments to the group here.
Well, I first just want to say thank you to Cease for saying what you said. I think there's maybe just a couple things. I guess that whole territorial acknowledgement thing kind of bugs me. To put it nicely, because I think there's a couple things that it does that is dehumanizing. One is when you only give 5 minutes to an Indigenous elder to speak at the beginning of an event, and then you shoo them off, and then you carry on with your mandate, whatever that is, you're still doing what you've always done. And you're maintaining, not building an unsustainable relationship with the people whose land you're on. And my suggestion is that rather than give 5 minutes to that person, give the whole day to that person, because they're going to need to speak. If you're going to have a good conversation about improving this unsustainable relationship, you need more than 5 minutes. And you also need to, I think there's a word that needs to get stricken from the acknowledgement as well. When you say I live, work, and play on the unceded territory, blah, 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 when you say play, it really hurts me as well, because you have invasions of lands in Eastern, you have invasions of lands paramilitaries in Secwepemc territories. You have it all over Canada, all over the continent, all over South America, where Indigenous people are fighting to save their resources and their cultures and their languages, and you have the audacity to come and play on that land that I'm trying to protect. That really hurts. And so I'd be mindful of that approach. It would be more respectful to not say that, and it would actually move the rather than just staying in this territorial acknowledgement, moving into an actual phase of a real sustainable relationship, which is what I think needs to happen. And I'm just gonna leave it there because it's nap time. I gotta nap my baby, so I gotta go. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your family time with us. Yeah. So we have a half an hour break right now. I think Ronnie, you set it up really well with that individual work we have to do, the group work we do, and then the potential of working together across groups, federating all these groups, and doing more of a movement for justice. Leanne and Leanne's got gifts. Gift bearer is going to come to the front. And Leanne and Donna, you're going to hear them later talk about their work, their journey of decolonizing their practice. But I also want to thank you for going to pick up the sandwiches and the Heart of the City volunteers. So there's 2 lineups for food around the tables. There's 2 salads. Donna's kindly agreed to share a few words about her own journey, and Donna is a school teacher. Donna is someone who I know is open about the stuff that she trips upon, and so I thought you bring both a fierceness, which I admire, but also a humility to kind of
sometimes
check in when mistakes are made. So maybe just let's start with Donna, and then we'll have time about 30 minutes in the small groups.
Thank you, Irwin. I'm honored to be here. Thank you all. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming. So Irwin put it to me that I talk about trip-ups and how to get back on track. I'm a 3rd and 4th generation white settler. My grandparents fled horrific conditions in Europe. One was a child soldier after fleeing an abusive stepfather, later to be shot through the side of his head, losing an eye. Another grandparent was abandoned by an impoverished family, coming here as an orphan. But when they arrived, they became part of upholding the horrific systems of oppression here, genocide and ecocide. So basically I'm a white mutt, or Wonder Bread, or as a friend, somewhat affectionately called me recently, white as fuck. I wanted to say, are you just noticing that now? So here I have trip up number 1, and I tried to be as honest as I can about stuff I'm actually dealing with right now, not give you a whole litany of things I think I've done wonderfully. So trip up number 1. I was going to ask you guys to give me a show of hands, but please don't. Because we don't have time, and I'm not sure what else it might trigger, but I don't yet have a financial plan that includes compensation to the peoples of this land. I admit it, I confess, I haven't done this work yet. How many of you have a mortgage? Besides me, you don't have to put up your hands. How many have a financial plan to give back? How many of you are middle class, like me? How many of you have a will that includes the Coast Salish people, giving back to the Coast Salish people? As I say this publicly, I commit to writing this trip up that I have. to get back on track. I'm trying to challenge you. I'm trying to make you uncomfortable. So I say, from what I've heard from my Coast Salish friends and members of my community, give the land back. How can we give the land back? Give back some of the resources that we and our families have stolen and benefited from. My wealth and well-being are based on several generations of stolen land and resources and all the privileges that go with white supremacy and being middle class. I owe a fuck of a lot, and I imagine a lot of you in here do, and I'll never be able to pay it back, let alone the genocide that's gone along with all that. So I am completely indebted, and I'm not talking in I hope you don't hear an intense guilt coming from me. I mean it just as a statement of fact. Donate generously. Give back the resources you have accumulated. Your families don't need it. Your white middle-class families don't need your money. They can figure it out. I'm kind of pissed off, but I'm talking to myself too. I am the first generation in my family to notice that we are white settlers. Everyone else would say we simply worked hard and we were good. Basically, we were better than everybody else, and that's why we did so well. Okay. Back to trip-ups and how to get back on track. One of my ongoing trip-ups is assuming I know a lot in relationship to this place. After all, I was born here and I grew up here. I've been here for almost 60 years. Then I listened to the Coast Salish, who have been here from time out of mind. Just want to take a breath. This week, I had the honor of working on transcribing some stories by Tsleil-Waututh elder A.B. George, talking about growing up on what we now call Burrard Inlet. And I've heard him speak before, and this is the second time I've been completely blown away by how he describes growing up on those waters, and how those waters have changed over time. I'm such a land-based person. I often think of Coast Salish lands, and I kind of mention in passing the waters, but also Cease this summer, I happened to go on a Takaya tour, which is a Tsleil-Waututh canoe company, and it was my good fortune, of course, and great honor that Cease was leading the canoe that day by happenstance. And she told the creation story, the origin story of Tsleil-Waututh. And I was shocked that the story was about Tsleil-Waututh coming out of, having been birthed out of Burrard Inlet and out of the waters. And I knew that Tsleil-Waututh meant people of the inlet, but I just hadn't put it together. Lee Miracle talks about living on the shacks, the squatter shacks, where Maplewood Flats, so-called Maplewood Flats conservation areas right now, on Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish land. I grew up in that same neighborhood. I went to school with Tsleil-Waututh kids, and I never even heard of these shacks. I was kept from there. I was somehow, that space was not a space that was part of my world. I've come to know that Coast Salish people have a sacred obligation to protect the lands and waters. They have no fucking choice. They have a sacred obligation. I first heard that from Carleen Thomas, Tsleil-Waututh elder Carleen Thomas. And that kind of blew my mind at the time, because it made it sound to me like I really got, wow, they have no choice. They're obligated. That's how I understood it. I've come to, I say here, I've come to know this by listening and reading. Okay, trip-ups and getting back on track. The last one, yes. Well, almost. How can I honor this sacred obligation and follow the ways of the Coast Salish people, their laws? How can I protect the lands and waters? A commitment to nurturing the lands and waters and each other instead of taking, always taking and being extractive. How have I gotten back on track recently with that trip up? Well, and I just wrote this example. I said, financially, I donate monies I donate monies to the frontline defenders, frontline land and water defenders who are actually defending the lands and the waters for us and our future generations. So it's the least I can do with the resources that I have. And I'm committed to stop the Kinder Morgan, now Trans Mountain, now Canada, so-called Pierre Trudeau pipeline with my body. I'm willing to do that. And I think it's one of the least things that many of us can do, especially us white middle-class people in the audience, is risk arrest. And again, I say this is a challenge to myself. The last trip up and getting back on track I have is thinking I don't know enough and not speaking up or taking action. Here's how I'm getting back on track. I've come to learn how empowering it is actually to speak up. If Coast Salish women like Audrey Siegel, C. Wyss, and Carleen Thomas can speak up and act so fearlessly on behalf of the lands and waters, surely I can speak up and act fearlessly too. I have an obligation to do that. It's our responsibility and in our best interest to act and speak up. We are in a climate emergency. There's a mass extinction going on, as well as ongoing genocide against all Indigenous protectors of the lands and the waters that we all need to survive. We continue to be greatly indebted to the Coast Salish people. It's not over. We're still accumulating debt because our ongoing, anyway, last sentence, I think, 2 more sentences. Disclaimer, anything I've said to you here today, I'm also saying to myself. Finally, as Tsleil-Waututh Elder Ta'a Amy George says, warrior up. He says that, or had that jacket on today. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Donna. Great. Okay. That was a big manifesto, Donna's manifesto. It was meant to be a quick lessons on trip-ups, but you did both. Half of that is really ideal for the third session, which is about mobilization and what we do together. Here's this other white male talking to a group of women about violence against women. That bystander training around violence against women, you know, that be more than a bystander, coaching men like me to be more than a bystander. So if we just, I have huge issues with that training model, because it basically says to men, okay, you can be patriarchal, but when you witness violence against women, that's when you intervene, rather than actually changing it and saying the whole paradigm of bystander, like men are either in alliance with women on an ongoing basis on all issues of women's rights, and not just on the issue of when they witness violence. If we use that over and talk about colonialism and our role as settlers and migrants, are we a bystander? Are we an ally? And I'm not even getting into the issue of who proclaims this and the tests and the policing. But Cleve Ali talks about accomplices, right? So we're either an accomplice, as Donna was leaning towards, saying she's not comfortable just witnessing this work being done. She actually wants to be in there shoulder to shoulder. So, you know, in terms of class, if you have your class analysis and class consciousness, it's not about, it's knowing who's on the side of the fence with you, who's on the side of the tracks with you. That's accomplice work. We have a co-venture to dismantle colonialism. We, as Cease mentioned earlier, we will be liberated by ending colonialism in a different way than Cease's family will be, but we will also be liberated that way, just as men will be liberated from patriarchy. We want to end patriarchy, not because we witness violence against women. We want to end patriarchy because patriarchy is fucked and it kills us, it kills women, it harms us, it kills women. And I apologize for, in a room of women as a male, using that metaphor, but I think it's instructive if sometimes we can't think like, how does this work, this accomplice work? Well, that's an example. And rather than these kind of liberal systems of partial measures, why don't we go full on and talk about where are we moving towards being accomplices in lifting up Coast Salish sovereignty. So I've talked a bit too much there. If we can spend 25 minutes in your circles, I think when you have your small groups, you can pick one of these. You can quickly go into all of them. It's up to your group. This policy activism, Heather and Leanne, I've witnessed them in Vancouver doing this work, both with the Vines Festival, Heather's Festival, the way she has transformed curating in Vancouver around, I would say, redress in action. Leanne's work in the downtown east side, in Maplewood Flats, with W2, around essentially creating spaces and organizations that face Coast Salish people's realities and integrating those. So if you can both share a few minutes about, similar to what Donna was doing from a personal perspective, about some of the policy challenges and kind of pushbacks that you had.
Hello, so my name is Heather and I am the Artistic Director at Vines Art Festival, which I founded 5 years ago now. So we just had our 5th festival this past August. I wanted to mention how much like the personal change work that I was talking about has impacted the organizational change and how vital I think that work is. I'm a dancer, and so I've done a lot of like embodied practice, and I've been really lucky to work with Cease in the garden and learn from Cease and the land actively. And so I just really want to emphasize how important that work is to transfer into organizational work. So some things that I thought of too is kind of how to work against this white grip that I imagine myself having and the other white folks having with the work that we do in learning in colonial systems. And to me, a grip is tense and not fluid, and it means that it's actually quite unstable and can fall apart quite easily. And it's really just not in relationship with the land. And so within that, I've been thinking a lot about how I would actually personally really want to work for Cease, or I'd want to work for the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations and that really leads all of my values. And so I attempt within the colonial structure that I work within to also listen and absorb as much as I can from the 3 host nations and urban Indigenous folks, so that I am working in a kind of braiding sense where I acknowledge all of those worldviews and value systems in the same way that I think about having a board or having an artistic director and really working from that leadership. So yeah, that's something. And then really defining that into a mission statement is that all of the programming is based on land and water justice. And so all of the art focuses on that value and on, land back, like we've been talking about. And that ends up bringing in a lot of allies, and so it's not an Indigenous festival, but it also brings forward allies and asks artists that aren't Indigenous to focus and center their work around those themes. So yeah, what Ronnie said about constriction, so I feel like I'm actively working to hold back some of the constriction. Yeah, I'm really working from the teachings of the land. As it is a land-based festival, we're working from those teachings, from the languages. We work with Wyss, so we hired a Squamish program director, and she supports all of the programming, not just the Indigenous programming, so that her vision is central as well to the programming that we do. And it's important, I think, to note within that when you're hiring those people, that you're ensuring that you're working to support what they want to be working on rather than just wasting their time to check off a token box. Our highest fees are always going to Indigenous artists regardless of colonial status. We don't take funding from anybody who supports extraction projects, including TD Bank and many other banks. Yeah, and then we also just are going to do a strategic plan coming up here with one settler and one Coast Salish person, and working with both of those worldviews so that our vision for Vines continues to work towards redress. Yes, anything else? I'm skipping around. I'm lucky because I'm the founder. I don't come up against a ton of barriers within the organization, so I can really listen and then act. Where I come up with barriers is when I'm working with funders or with sometimes the city and just trying to work around their bureaucracy. And so, yeah, it's not as I am lucky that I can follow values in that sense. So I'm grateful for that. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. That's 3 minutes.
So the way you said you didn't say you're on the vanguard, but you said you're not necessarily accountable to a group of people that are mucking it up. So that was a choice, because you do have a board of directors still.
Yeah.
So you made a choice to organize your board in such a way that they're actually aligned with those values.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm Leanne. Thank you all for being here and sharing this work together. Each of you could probably be up here too. I'm recognizing that. And I'm also really grateful to people like Wyss and Ronnie. It was great to hear them here sharing all that they are doing the work to share with us. It's very generous and a lot of their time, and I gained a lot through them, and I'm part of the trauma that Ronnie was talking about, moving through some of the work through Vancouver Indigenous Media Arts Festival and other organizations. So, but I thought I'd just quickly talk briefly about a nonprofit organization that I worked with that's outside of my usual realm. I was an operation manager for a nonprofit that does a lot of work with First Nations communities in resource-based communities, but from my position, I was just trying to work structurally within that organization, looking at the board, looking at the staffing, the policies, and doing presentations at our staff retreats, so that as a community of workers and in terms of our principles and guidelines, how are we learning and keeping to push ourselves around our commitment to those relationships. But also, we were in a co-working space, and so I also created a book club with non-Indigenous people to read about from Indigenous writers and from a whole range of literature practices, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, so that we were taking up the space together to learn and have those conversations without taking up the space of Indigenous people. So Just repeating, you know, that I'm always making mistakes. Like in the work that I'm doing at the Maplewood Flats in Tsleil-Waututh Territory, and I'm always making mistakes. I made one just this past week around, you know, it's all my busy work. You know, I need to get this done, so I better send this email to so-and-so in Tsleil-Waututh Nation to get some information from them. And it's like, that's not her timeline, that's my timeline. So it's like respecting their space. Like Ronnie was saying about the cultural work, that's not what I'm gonna be. I don't need to be there, I don't need to know that, but I need to understand that that work is taking place, and that if I'm trying to schedule something for the weekend, and I know that in the winter months, this is when they do the ceremonial work, I need to know not to be inviting them to come and do work in the venue that we're hosting on their land. So it's just like really getting to know better about what's going on in their communities, and respecting that, and staying out of the way in that way. So knowing when to engage with them and in what ways. How are we in relationship with them? Are we honoring their time and inviting ourselves and asking if it's a good time? So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Beautiful. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Heather. Okay, so now we've got about 20, 25 minutes.